So we're gonna start off from last week, right? That's always been a present. That's always been a present danger, right, with blackness. Whether you're talking about from the South about lynchings and even the North about lynchings, right? Even if you're talking about like police brutality, right up on our communities, and even with this conversation about with voting rights and women's rights about being having autonomy over their bodies, right? We've always been under this oppressive system, and it's global. It's not just in the United States. It's global, right? Let's get that in right now. But it shows how I think the song shows how number one, black folks tried to cope, right? Because even in that quote, he talks about this conversation about, don't critique me, and I'm paraphrasing really badly, don't critique me about how we cope. Like, we're trying to survive. We're trying to manage the best way we can through communal and individualized acts, right? And music, a lot of times going back, has been that source of strength, whether it's through religious, cultural, spiritual, whatever facet we've had, music has always been one of the ground roots of our cultural understanding and experiences, right? It helps us to heal, it helps us to deal, and it helps us to move forward, right? To strategize and also to be hopeful, right? But also be realistic, right? We've been having these conversations since the 1970s, right? 1960s, 1970s, right? Malcolm X talks about police brutality in many of his speeches, right? It's been one of the things that we talked about within our when we talked about political agendas, right? In the 1970s, about we need to address police brutality within our communities. So it's always been present. That danger has always been present. To be black in America, there's always be to understand that you're always going to be in danger, right? And dealing with that is traumatic, especially if you have nothing to that would directly attack it, in the sense of like where is the, you talk about governmental intervention. Where's the governmental intervention? We know that's very spotty at best, right? And a lot of times it has to fall upon us to deal with it, right? They tell us to deal with it. They tell us to say, hey, that happened, centuries ago. Let that go. No, I can't let it go, right? Because we're still dealing with it, right? Just because we're not shackled physically in the fields in the South does not necessarily mean that slavery has ended. It's discontinued in different forms, right? If I'm have to fight tooth and nail to get like student loans, right, in order to go to school to get a better life, and I'm shackled by that, right? That's based upon racial trauma, right? And that's intergenerational trauma, right? If I have to deal with police keep coming to my neighborhoods and over policing and making sure that the city maintains some type of segregation. Our cities are more segregated now than they were back in the day, right? And we know that's by design. So if we know this is by design, the system is set up by design to oppress. That's always going to be traumatic for the people that's suppressing, right? And so when he was talking about the multi-generational conversations of oppression in his songs, I was like, yeah, I remember that. And even as a young child at 5 years old, he had to deal with that, right? About the oppression that he had to deal with, like the conversations about his family had to deal with. So that's a lot for just anybody to deal with, but also for people to deal
with. That's it. And yeah, I just want to go off those 2 or 3 words. Deal with it. And I think this is the ultimate legacy of enslavement, because sometimes when we have these conversations about the impact of enslavement, I think we give too much power to the white supremacists. I don't want to paint the picture, as we mentioned, we're all, students and aspiring, experts as much as we can be in Africana studies. And we look at the African world as a whole. And I don't want to paint the picture that Africa was free from trauma or these types of things before enslavement and colonization, because it wasn't. We're human beings. Every community deals with these things. But the issue with slavery, I think the impact it does is, back home, before slavery and colonization, we had the mechanisms to deal with it. We had the cultural institutions and mechanisms in place to, when trauma occurs, whether it was intercommunal violence, intracommunal violence, whether we're talking about whatever, we had those mechanisms, spiritual, political, economic, to deal with it. What slavery did is it cut us off from those mechanisms. So we had to, do what we do, which is, improvise And in some ways, our improvisation was successful. We mentioned the music, we mentioned the spirituality that morphed to meet the needs that we needed. Then in some ways, it's not. And these are the things that Kendrick gets into about how we try to deal with it, because we've been cut off from those mechanisms. So when we look at slavery and its after effects in this trauma, when folks say, well, it's over, deal with it, you took away our mechanisms. That's why those comparisons that people make between us and other ethnic groups in this country, they say, well, look at Korean folks, Chinese folks, Jewish folks, Italian folks, they dealt with it, their whatever, and they're doing right. What about you? They still had their cultural mechanisms to figure those things out. Mm. We were divorced to that. And even on the continent now, because of colonialism, it's a little bit better on the continent, but still, with that colonial imposition, a lot of those mechanisms to deal with these types of things were either completely destroyed or more importantly, devalued. A lot of times by our leaders. So we might have had mechanisms even during enslavement to deal with it, but then some of our people got, brainwashed, like all of us, I mean, to some extent, to thinking that what we had before was no good, and we need to adopt other forms, and we lose those things that would have helped us, quote unquote, deal with it. That is part of why the trauma keeps continuing. I think we've done a good job over the past couple of decades recognizing it. Dr. Leary's work and that, but then how do we need to investigate more and engage with those scholars more that are looking to our African culture and seeing what ways we can collectively deal with it. And I think there's a lot of people making those strides. We just got to get more into that. Definitely.
I think too, right, and going back to Kendrick's work, because I don't want to be this. I think that it is very diminutive to just refer to it as a song, right? Because it's so much more than a song, right? Because again, when we look at, because I purposely, I told my fellas, I purposely wore my Boys in the Hood t-shirt today, right? And I wore it because largely within the context of our community, we have been a voiceless people many times. And so all music has been the thing that articulated, we found places, safe places to articulate what it is that were the struggles of our people, and coming on or expounding upon what Dr. Ledbetter said, I think is extremely important, because he said some really, really good stuff, right? But I think that even more so than, because this is the thing that I always like to stress to people when they only talk about slavery, right? To only talk about slavery means that we ignore the other things that happen and continue to happen, right? I'll give you an example. Many people don't know that at the time of Frederick Douglass's death, Mr. Douglass was working on prison reform. Because he started to notice that many of the things that happened within slavery were continued within the system of sharecropping and prison work, right? So a lot of these white sharecroppers who had lost their inventory and their free labor from the Emancipation Proclamation began to unjustly imprison Black men and women on their plantations to continue the work, right? So if he knew in the 1860s that prisons were going to be the new forms of slavery, what does that say about today, right? And if we go a little bit further and we talk about, there's a brother, I think his name is Tom Burrell. He wrote a book called Brainwash, Challenging the Myth of Black Inferiority. We've got to talk about the very calculated and systematic ways that that the media has used its mechanisms to further oppress and subjugate Black people. So then what happens, we see, because it's almost like a hamster in the wheel sort of thing, because so these methods of oppression happen, and what ends up happening, because people always say, well, what about Black on Black crime? What about that, right? But that is the fruit and not the root. What church can I say that? That's the fruit and not the root. The fruit is Black on Black crime. The fruit is lower test scores. The fruit is poor high schools. The fruit is ghettos. The root is poverty. The root is racism. The root is continued breaking up of Black homes, even starting when you look back at the welfare system, when Black mothers were not allowed to be married or have fathers in homes, which didn't allow them to build the financial wherewithal to get out of those communities, right? And so even when you talk about what the banking system did in denying Black people the ability to live in certain areas and denying them mortgage loans, because many people don't know that mortgage loans didn't start being 30 years until they start making these sort of loans to Black people. So what does that do for your capacity to build wealth? What does that do? What does that do for your capacity to hand something, a legacy down to your children?
And these are the things that particularly have the traumatic effect on Black men. And I'm saying that as a Black man. So, I mean, this whole discussion that we're having, I'm not an expert in trauma. I'm not a musicologist. My background is Africana studies and human rights law and political science. But I am a 35-year-old Black man who's a father. So all those things you just talked about, whether it's prisons, economic trauma and economic warfare, spiritual warfare, and chemical warfare in various forms, not just drugs, but also the foods that we eat. As a Black man who's been told in this society, it's really warped, because we've been told as men, you are supposed to be able to provide for your family. And if you don't, then something is wrong with you. You're not really a man. But we're going to throw all these traumatic things in the way to stop you from doing that, and then benefit off of your reaction to that trauma. So it's we're paying for our own trauma in a way. Our bodies are going into the jails that are benefiting the folks that live around the prisons that generally aren't us. Where what's really sad is people that don't look like us benefit off of both our trauma and our pain.
Yes.
I mean, both our trauma and pain as well as our joy. I mean, not to get into it, and I'm not trying to denigrate Kendrick's piece, because it's a masterpiece. But even that, as we're listening to and reflecting on it, his record label is a subsidiary of Universal Music Group. So when we talk about the media, we talk about all these things that are perpetuating this, there's only 3 record companies in the world, really. Everything else is subsidiary. There's Warner's, there's Universal, and there's Sony. So although we're making Kendrick's family, wealthier by listening and the streaming numbers and all of that, the lion's share of that money is going to some white man named Lucian Grange, the CEO of Universal Music Group. So the even when we're enjoying something, whether it's treating ourselves to watching something on Disney Plus, going to the movies, or doing this, a lot of times we're so unconscious to that aspect of it that even when we try to express joy, we're giving our resources to somebody else. And then not even to mention the trauma and the pain. Because when we're sad, what do? We drink. And what do? We don't drink Black owned. We get Hennessy. Hennessy ain't owned by Black people. that's how it goes. That's not owned by Black people. The fast food that we eat to make us feel better, a lot of that time stuff's we're not buying from Black farms and that type of thing. So our pain, trauma, as well as our joy, is all connected to somebody else's is wealth building project. And that to me is one of these legacies of the current period that we're in. But always, like I said, it's not insurmountable. It's not insurmountable. And having this conversation here at Cheyney even though we're virtually, but here, this institution is putting this on. This is the place where we are tasked with recognizing these things. And then since, we're doctors, supposedly, we're supposed to give the prescription to overcome them. And I hope that's what we can do at this institution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Simmons, what do you have to say? And also, I want to put this caveat in there. We want to hear from you guys, right? Because I see we have quite a few people watching on YouTube. We have some of our colleagues from Cheyney, the first HBCU, that have joined us on this Zoom. And so if you guys have anything that you want to add to the discussion or any insight that you would like to share, please put it in the comments for us, because we would love to hear from you. And so I'm going to hand that back over to Dr. Simmons.
Just to piggyback, right? As you was talking, I was sitting there, I was like, dang, a lot of stuff that we do to try to go back to get full for ourselves. I think the piece also, it tries to have this reclamation point, right? You mentioned he mentions ancestors all throughout, right? Like his grandmother is watching him, like, she's like watching and guiding him through his decisions, right? His mother is going through these traumatic, and also trying to find out ways to support her family in the song, right? The family is trying to deal with these different notions of what it means to be feminine or masculine, right? Sexuality conversations are going on. In the backdrop of trying to be as human as possible, right? Because we live in a place in which is not looking at us as human, right? And even the place where we try to find joy at, like Dr. Ledbetter said, is still going back to this very oppressive capitalistic system, right? They're benefiting off of our stuff. So even when we talk about this conversation about wealth, right? Wealth in what, right? Like going back to our systems, right? We didn't have conversations about poverty, right? I mean, there wasn't no mass inequality conversations about the very rich and the very poor, right? Or in the conversation with like people were like, you have people dying out here, right? Trying to figure out ways in which to survive, right? Economically speaking, let's talk about that, right? You have people like rising housing prices, right? You're trying to figure out where you're going to stay at. You got people got to figure out how they're going to pay for medical.
Can't even feed the babies. There's a goddamn formula shortage. I mean, and then if you really think there's an actual shortage, you're crazy. It's not an actual shortage. There's capitalist pressures that cause that. And babies aren't being fed. This is a society that we live in. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fine. It's great. But yeah, like you have the shortage, but you also have like shortage of food, shortage of housing, shortage like rental properties, right? And it's not because we don't have they made it so that way you have a shortage of housing, prices go up, you have to figure out where you're going to be at, right? So you have to figure out these different ways in which you're going to try to be as whole as possible, right? And even we have these conversations about like how we manage our families, right? Like one of the lines that hit me was like it was an interaction between him and his cousin, right? And how in the like Kendrick Lamar was trying to protect his cousin, like, no, he didn't do it, and he did not do it. But then like the family pressure and then beating up on his mother, so that because they felt that he did not protect Kendrick, which also ostracized the cousin, right? This all this trauma is going on that's happening. And I'm sitting here like, dang, like I'm going back to my childhood, like in which is like, how did I try to protect myself in different ways that I felt that I had to, right? In terms of like sexuality, in terms of like how I was going to be able to maneuver and navigate, especially in the South, right? And also about how these conversations about like what love is, right? And how do you express love and give love back, right? That was all in there. And like seeing what, like number one, we also don't talk about our trauma. That's also individualized kind of conversation, right? Trauma's supposed to be what's going on with us supposed to be shared with us, right? We're supposed to say, hey, as a community, as a family, right? This is what I'm going through as a member of this community, and being taught that we cannot say that. Like we were like when our women were being raped during enslavement, we didn't talk about it. We just tried to fix it. Right, when our men was being raped and shipped off, right? We didn't talk about it. We acted like after they left, we sung songs to commemorate them leaving, I mean, we remember them, right? But we didn't talk about it, because if we talked about it, we we're gonna get injured and hurt, right? So even this conversation about us being able to express the vulnerability of what we're going through, like this should not be this should not be a groundbreaking piece. This should be a piece that we talk about on an everyday basis,
Yeah.
right?
And
About vulnerability.
and you're mentioning things about childhood, and it's funny because listening to this, like I said at the beginning, like it's not my story, but it's similar in that we're all in these families, and as you get older, you learn more things.
Mm-hmm.
And I really want to personalize this, not just make it about like academic conversations, because we're all members of families and stuff. And sometimes you'll see family members, if you got a big family, you always wonder like why this person acts like this, or what created this person's behavior, or why they like that. And at least for me, and I'll tell you all like a short thing, like a couple years ago, my brother and I started, trying to collect stories from the family. People are getting older, people are passing on, new children are being born. We want to document these things. So we started using the pandemic and using the new technology and things to get on Zoom and record conversations with elders. And since we're older now, and a lot of the women in our family are still alive and telling us these stories, or telling us stories about people that have already passed on, so they're more open with things. You hear all of these tales of trauma,
Mm-hmm.
particularly sexual abuse and all these other things. And even though it didn't happen directly to you, it happened to your grandmother, your aunts, your mother, all these things, and you're sitting there as a 35-year-old man, damn near at the brink of tears, feeling both helpless, angry, sad, all at the same time. And a lot of our families are dealing. Then it makes you think, going back to what I said, it makes you think about, oh, well, that makes sense why this person has the type of behavior that they have, because they've been through all this stuff that nobody talks about. Mm-hmm. So for all of us on this call, I mean, when you think about family, you think about people that are around you that may not be exhibiting the best behavior at all times, and whether it's in the work setting, understand that there might be something that they're going through, and just have a little bit more grace and understand what's going on, because, and I know it's everybody's family. We all got these things, and it's like sometimes if I would like to like, I won't say you're lucky to learn about them as a kid, because kids shouldn't be put with that weight either. But you, as an adult, hearing about these things is now our responsibility to try to, make sure that they don't happen again. And one last thing, going back to what Matt said, because I was going to mention that too, about when Kendrick talks about his mother's mother visited him often for years. Had we been in touch with our cultural mechanisms, that wouldn't have been, because the way he presents it kind of in the song is almost like he was kind of like he wasn't looking forward to her visiting him. It's almost like she stopped at a certain point. But we had mechanisms that you can communicate with those. There was something that she was trying to tell him. She wasn't just coming to act. And folks on this call might think, okay, Ledbetter has lost it. He's talking about, no, this is part of our culture. Our ancestors are all around. And they have messages for people. And we had mechanisms to get those messages and use them to better our lives and the lives of our family. So even that part of it can help deal with our trauma, because if we're talking about intergenerational trauma, and if in African cultural understandings, our ancestors are still here, they're helping us. They can help us heal if we know the mechanisms to communicate with them. Yeah, brother, when you brought that up, that made me.
And I want to
my point. I like it.
I want to interject this, because I think that this is sort of like an amalgamation of what both of you guys have been saying, right? But we really hadn't touched on it yet, I don't think. But one of the things that I think that that scholars are starting to see more and more, and that is not a myth, but it is very much so, that trauma can become encoded in our DNA. trauma becomes encoded in our DNA. I'll give you an example. They have TV shows. They make TV shows and movies about this all the time, right? So supposedly there was a case of a lady who she received a heart transplant, right, from somebody that was murdered. And so this lady kept having these nightmares about being murdered. Mr. Word, you heard of this one before? Okay. And this actually happened. She kept having nightmares of being murdered. And so she went to the police about it. And it turns out what the lady was dreaming about was actually what happened to the person that she received the heart from. So in very much the same way, a lot of the trauma that happens in the context of our communities, right, is very much embedded in the trauma that our ancestors are going through. Even when we get down to, let's say, for instance, Kendrick basically narrates it when he talked about how his mother responded to what she thought happened to him. Right? That was a trauma response, right? And even how he responded was a trauma response, because that traumatic event was encoded in her DNA. And even when we talk about these issues of sexual molestation and all these things that tend to be sometimes in higher numbers in our community, many people don't understand that that even comes from slavery. You know, where where fathers were forced to sleep with their daughters, and mothers were forced to sleep with their sons, and so on and so forth, even sleeping with their children to create more slaves, right? Do you really think that this sort of vile behavior, this incestuous, very much pathological way of thinking and living just automatically stopped when these people were freed? No, there was very much, and a word I picked up, and I'm gonna have to do like Dr. Ledbetter and make a disclaimer. I'm not a psychologist. I don't hold a psychology degree. I have a doctorate in African studies and another one in English. But, you know, some things we know to be true, right? A lot of times what happens for us as Black folks, we're constantly living in a state of cognitive dissonance, right? Where we're forced to live in between what we know is happening, but what we can't acknowledge, right? What we know is right, but what we can't do, right? So I know it is right to, let's say, for instance, love and protect our daughters and love and protect our sons. But at the same time, I gotta let these folks babysit my babies because I'm working 12, 14-hour shifts. And I gotta feed them. Oh, cousin so-and-so or uncle so-and-so, they might not be all together, but somebody, because I'm making the decision between feeding them and having a roof over their head or what I perceive their safety is, right? And even this notion of strength, sometimes this pervasive notion of always having to be strong is much more hurtful than it is helpful. Because with Kendrick, when he starts the song, and I love the start, when he said, I'm sensitive, I feel, and what that says, but you know, we always talk about the strong Black man, the strong Black woman, right? But we are feeling, and this repression of feelings is driving so many people insane. We see it through a manifestation sometimes of drug abuse, alcohol abuse, right? Because people have been taught to suppress what they feel instead of giving voice to their trauma. And he even talks about that. He said, you never had to deal with grief until you had to do it sober. So he's even talking about how many of us have been taught to repress what it is that we feel. And so, and the reason we're talking about, especially African-American people, is because this is who Kendrick is writing this song about, right? Even though the song is for everybody, just like with anything that Black people do, it starts with us, but it really is effectual to anyone who listens, because everybody experiences trauma. Everybody experiences grief, right? But these conversations are important because most times in our community, these things have not been dealt with.
And I think when you because you mentioned about the sensitivity, right? About, especially with like Black men, right? Black men, we're taught a lot of times to cut off the sensitive parts of ourselves, right? To not have access to those like conversations about crying. I remember I would ask my students during class, I'd be like, so what emotions, if you could name your emotions, what three emotions are you most in tune with? Right. And they'll say happy, anger, and sadness, right? And I'd be like, okay, then, but what's the underlying issues with those feelings, right? There's something that that prompt those off. That's not your go-to. That's not your anger is not your go-to. I mean, anger is your go-to, but what's the underlying issue? And so I was like, yo, black men, when's the last time you cried? A lot of times they can't tell me when they cried, right? And they did it. It's like it's a shame around. I'm like, no, you cannot be shameful about the emotion that you have. That's being human. But we've been taught a lot of times to not do that. To showcase, we have to be strong, right? Black men, we have to sit here and quote unquote protect our black women or our communities, right? But I'm like, okay, then what about us? Like sometimes, we deal with a lot of stuff ourselves, and we can't reach out. Like I'm not. It's funny when I talk to black women. And black women, a lot of times they can get in their cliques. They can have these big old conversations about what's going on with their lives. And I'll be sitting here like, I wish that as black men, we have this like similar access and similar conversations, because it's hard for me to say, and I'm still working through that myself, right? Going to therapy, engaging with my like, I remember when my brothers and I would not tell each other we loved each other, right? It was like, I'll show it by giving you money, or I'll show you by protecting you. No, sometimes you have to say it, right? And also with showing it. Sometimes I have to see you cry, right? Because I never saw my father cry. My father go into the field, and he'll make he'll plant his crops and cultivate his crops. That's when he'll go to cry and pray. But when he came back to the house, he was like this very strong black man. I'm sitting there like, so that's how I have to deal with stuff. That's how I have to manage my emotions. I have to be very independent. If I can't get it, I'm not going to ask anybody else to get it. And the interdependence that our African centeredness taught us, right, to be in touch with the community. A lot of times we don't do that. If we can't do it by ourselves, then we don't need to do it, right? Or and we have to go to these different ways in which to and if we have like pain, we have to drown it, right? And with Kendrick Lamar, he goes to like sexual addiction, which is an addiction that a lot of people within our communities deal with. But also you have these conversations about drug and alcohol abuse. You have conversations about like different addictions that we go through, and it's like these are not just from this is what we could cope with. These are the mechanisms that we had, right? And these mechanisms that we had, a lot of times they help us, but they also destroy us too. Like alcohol makes you feel good in the moment, right? It makes you not think about what pain you're going through. It numbs the pain, right? Because to really sit in pain and not have a quote unquote access to something that would like alleviate it or absolve it. That's a thing, right? To like, and even have the conversation. How you doing, Dr. George? Even have the conversation about, hey, how can I access, going back to this community conversation, like the community is supposed to help you deal with that trauma. It's supposed to also help you deal into healing. And if we don't have the healing mechanism towards to access to, then we're gonna go back to those same things that will make us good in the moment, but destroy us in the long run. And that's what the capitalist system also does. It makes you return back. It gives you a little taste of like, hey, this is what freedom looks like. This false sense of freedom, this false sense of like security, this false sense of like numbing the pain. And then we go right back when we get back to being sober. It's just too overwhelming, and then we can't talk about it. Like, how many of us really had access monetarily to a therapist growing up? Right. The best therapy that we had was quote unquote church. Right. And we also know that the church was a great thing, a great entity for us to go to and get some type of healing. But the church also ostracized too. It also hurt.
Very much so. I mean, and that's that double traumatization when you're traumatized there. I mean, I don't know if you guys are paying attention to the news, but there's like T.D. Jakes' son-in-law that just got locked up. He had a church, part of a church that I guess it was dedicated to youth ministry, and he's locked up now for violating children. So even in those institutions, you have things that happen. So how does somebody deal with that? You know what I mean? Like you're going for that type of spiritual healing that you're talking about, then you're re-traumatized. So there's that conversation that we got to have too. And Yeah, I mean, just Black men being sensitive is it's a sign of strength. See, I know what we're trying to say when we talk about like moving away from the strong Black man, strong Black woman thing, but I'm not ready to give up on it completely. In that, I just think we need to redefine strength.
Okay.
It's not strong to just go, 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 and then burn out. That's not strength. That's not going to benefit you as an individual, and that's not going to benefit us in our struggle. You know, I always look at our situation as, and use the analogy of warfare. It's not even really an analogy because we're dying. So, you know, on so many fronts. But every army in the world, and the studies have shown, when their soldiers are in the concert of battle, ever since World War II, the best armies in the world always incorporate R&R, rest and recuperation, can't talk about that, rest and recuperation, into their battle plan. You can only be in the field of battle for so long before you get that 10 days of R&R. And then you come back in it, because it doesn't, the studies show it doesn't benefit the company, the army as a whole, for you to be burnt out and psychologically, physically, all these things. So they all incorporate it in their struggles. So as we're engaged in this struggle for the development of the African world, which is what it is, economic, political, social, spiritual development, we need to make sure R&R is a part of our strength strategy. Without it, we're useless soldiers, and we're not going to advance the way we need to advance. So I just think we got to recognize what this piece is a, and I love the end. What they, I think, and again, I'm not a musicologist, but I think I heard it referred to as the coda, the last part of the song where, you know, it gets more and more intense, and his voice, that is a sign of strength. The whole piece is a sign of strength, even from the quietest parts to that coda is an expression of strength. So we need to redefine what strength is. We're not the John Henry stereotype that we're just gonna go out and what do you call it, hammer steel,
right, right,
until we die. That's not strength. The strength is, oh man, I'm starting to feel it. Let me rest a little bit. I'm engaging this emotion. Let me feel this emotion. Let me reach out to somebody that I can deal with this. That's strength. Yeah, anything else is weakness, and there's no place in our struggle. We don't need it because you become a liability. I mean, I love you as an individual, but I'm more concerned about our victory in the struggle. And we don't need you to be a liability. Just my thoughts.
I think you know, you guys have said some very powerful things. We've been getting some awesome comments on YouTube. People have really been, you know, really sort of engaging in this discussion. We have Lionel, who said, Brother Lionel said, the enduring trauma, and then there's surviving trauma. Some of our family members are dealing with the latter more than the rest of us. Kind of validating the points that you got, that Dr. Ledbetter made when he talked about how we have to have show some grace, right? How we should have to have some grace. Jennifer talked about the maintenance of certain types of cultural desired strength, you know, and certain family-made trauma, and even our colleagues in here, Mr. Word is talking about how some people had access to us and how it traumatized us. And Ms. Adams talking about that trauma DNA, that trauma encoded in our DNA, coming up in health issues like high blood pressure, hypertension, and those sort of things, right? And that's why I always like to use the word pathology, right? Because whenever you meet a pathologist, that's somebody who studies like what a disease does and how a disease comes about. Well, we have a pathology in our communities, right? That there's a sickness, and I'm not saying that, and please by no means think that I'm being doom and gloom, because I think for every problem there's always a cure, right? For example, there are a number of people nowadays, and I know you guys have heard this, it talks about that there's no longer a reason for historically Black colleges and universities. And I always take issue with folks that, look, I found my tribe. But you know, you always find people who say these, well, that's racist. That's reverse racism to have a historically Black college, right? And so people make these sort of comments and they get upset and they say, well, there's not a room for it, or that you're not teaching Black students how to navigate in a real world that is not all Black, right? And what happens there is a number of things, right? Number one, people who say things like that negate the fact of Black trauma that happens within the school system, that has to be redressed on our campuses, right? Because for many of us, this is the first time that we come into a setting with people who look like us, that encourage us to be the best us. You know, I like to tell my story in that I'm from South Memphis, home of 666 Mafia, okay? I'm from the hood, okay? And so, and I went to a hood high school, all right? But when I got to Tennessee State University in Nashville, Tennessee, shout out to Tennessee State University, another HBCU. When I got there, being nurtured by professors who were more than professors, but actually like aunties and mothers who saw that Carolyn was a bright girl who always, and I don't even know if I was as bright as they said I was, but they were always telling me how brilliant I was, how smart, how articulate and eloquent I was. And when somebody could tell you something, even if it's a lie, you start to believe it when they say it enough, right? And so what happens is that confidence, right? Though our schools give us that level of confidence that is necessary to navigate in a world that doesn't like people that look like us.
It does it so much. I mean, that's the ultimate. I'm a graduate of the first degree granting historically Black college, Lincoln University. I've been teaching at Cheyney for, it'll be 10 years in January. I love HBCUs. I mean, you go, I've run into colleagues that went to other universities and they always seem to have trouble in some spaces. I feel confident everywhere because I saw people that look like me, like you said, doing these great things. It's not just professors, it's the alumni when they come back that are running things. Because until this day, we know the stats, we still produce majority of the Black doctors, Black lawyers, Black judges, Black engineers, Black everything else. So you see it, and you see Black excellence constantly. I mean, my story is very much like yours. I went to a hood high school in Pittsburgh. It's closed now because it's considered a dropout factory because only 50% of the people graduated. I went to Lincoln, went to Temple, and got another master's degree from the University of Oxford, the oldest, most prestigious white institution in the world. And being there and being around these buildings that been up since the 16th century and all this stuff, and being imbued in the whitest of white spaces, all I kept thinking about was Lincoln prepared me for this. I'm not impressed. I can look at these things and look at this space and be appreciative of another person's culture, but I didn't value that. I wasn't looking at, oh man, I'm thinking about my own experience. Like, yeah, but I went to Lincoln though. Like this is cool, but I went to the school that Nkrumah went to, that Nnamdi Azikiwe went to. Like, this is great for them, and I'm appreciative of the education I received. But I ain't giving I shouldn't probably say this is being recorded, but I'm not giving a dime to Oxford. Like, they got enough money. Like, when people ask me every day, when people ask me for holidays and things, my birthday, what do you want? I say, whatever money you gonna spend on me, give it to Lincoln. Give it to Lincoln. It don't matter, $10, $20, whatever you're gonna give to me, give to Lincoln. And I know we're it's not off topic because it's on, because we're talking about those institutions that produce Black excellence. That is one of these remedies that we're talking about to this trauma. The spaces that we created and what we do at historically Black colleges, like Cheyney, like Lincoln, like Tennessee State, like Tulu, like all the places that we come from, we're here not because of the pay That ain't it. If you can check our pay. That it ain't because of the pay. It's because we love our people, and we love showing other people that aren't from our culture the love that we have for our people and the love that we have for humanity. So when you come here, you're going to get love. Now, if you're in my class, you might not feel like you're being loved. Just because I love you so much, I'm not going to let you present a side of yourself that you shouldn't show the world. I'm going to bring out the best part of you because I love you. So this is what you get at HBCU. This is what you get at Cheyney. You get the remedy to a lot, not the complete remedy, but we try our best to have these, like the discussion that we're having now about trauma, about the remedies to it, about institution building, about giving you the skills that you need to help take your family at least some ways out of these things, to give you the language to go back to your family, not just the language, but on a very, real to the economic power to at least alleviate that part, to say, okay, we're going to deal with the trauma, but let me at least get my family together as much as I can financially, so we don't got to worry about that trauma, the economic trauma. Now we can get to these other things. We can deal with that. But I got from Cheyney the skills that I needed to get economic, to get my confidence together, because I'm being taught by Black professors that share the same experience as me, that love me. I'm being treated by staff, whether it's the cafeteria staff that's feeding me food, whether it's the staff that's cleaning up, whether it's the staff that's the academic success coaches, the tutors, whatever it is. Everybody is there to make sure that I succeed, and by extension that my family succeeds. And not only succeed, like I said, economically, that's just the foundation part, but also all these other realms. That's what we do here at Cheyney. And for those of you that are watching, and many of you are maybe alum, current students, prospective students, parents with children who are thinking about sending them someplace, if you send them here, we're here. And these are the types of conversations that we're having. And it's not just about talking. We're giving your youth and anybody else, because we got students that aren't youth, that the skills that they need to transform their families, their communities, and the world. We've been doing it since 1837, and we will continue to do it. And yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
But because I know we're winding it down a little bit, and I wanted to make sure that we were also solution oriented, right? And I think that part of us being here is part of that solution, right? Because also when we talk about economic empowerment, because I also forgot to give a shout out to my other HBCU, where I got my doctorate, Clark Atlanta University.
Come on, Clyde.
The Black Mecca, okay? But what happens is that when we look at this, right, when we look at this issue, most of the people in our community don't own businesses, don't have generational wealth to pass down. Our schools and education becomes the last vestige that we can use toward economic empowerment. I'm not saying that it's impossible, right? Like, I think, I believe in having many streams of income. I was about to say my other word I love to say, hustling, okay? So, but I believe in having many streams of income, right? But what happens is that I believe that also has to be something foundational, right? Because everybody's not going to automatically become super sent, and I think that's beautiful, right? Like, I follow her, I admire her work ethic. But there's some of us that we have to get the degree in business. We have to get the degree in engineering. We have to get the degree in English. We have to get the degree in psychology, because these things are still very much needed. And these become the pathways or doorway openers to opportunity that we otherwise wouldn't have a chance to get. So I think that part of the healing that we have to have is empowerment, right? And part of empowerment is educational. Never let anybody tell you that education is outdated and overrated. As the old folks at home, because I'm from the South, if you haven't been able to tell from my accent, but as the devil is a liar, okay? So education is still very much a necessary thing, very much a necessary thing. And so I think, I have a question over here that I want to pose to Dr. Simmons and Dr. Ledbetter. One of our one of our watchers from YouTube asked the question, do you think defining Black men and Black women as strong aids to the lack of empathy that people have for us? And he used the example, I'm sorry, she used the example of like medical racism, right? Give Black folks a certain amount, they don't give Black folks like painkillers as they should, or prescribe them certain medicines because of this idea that our bodies are stronger than other people.
Definitely. I mean, but I think, yes, it's because we're being defined by physical strength. I think that's a detriment. I mean, they used to say that in boxing all the time. Black people have harder heads. Like, so, yeah, that's definitely real. Yeah, I agree. I don't know what. Yeah, yes.
Okay, Dr. Simmons, what about you?
So yeah, yes, based on physical strength, but also based on a racist ideology that we can just take anything, right? Because we were looked at as like not being human. So we can do anything we want to these bodies. We can put them like with the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, right? With the different like with eugenics and also with like oppressing Black women's bodies, right? In order to find out the origins of gynecology, right? So we know these a lot of what medical racism is based upon the subjugation of Black bodies, right? But also knowing that a lot of times that strength that we had makes. I mean, I think that the strength that they try to force upon us was a lot of strength that we had to utilize to survive, right? We had to adapt. Right. And I think that, like, it's going back to what Dr. Ledbetter said earlier, like, I think we need to redefine what strength means, right? What is that? What is, I mean, because a lot of times we had to get our strength from the community. And I think that's what Tougaloo College taught me, right? As an HBCU grad as well, right? Because we had to rely upon each other to survive. There was times in which I was like, yo, when am I get my next meal from? And the community I got you a hot plate, right? Burger, fries, all that stuff, right? Like you said, the cafeteria people, your professors, right? But also like us coming together to try to figure out ways in which we could not just combat and resist, but also have conversations about what liberation looks like for us too. As far as because we're not a monolith, Blackness is not a monolith. We're not one type of people. And so being able to congregate into spaces which are like Black focus or Black centric, African centered, we're able to have these different conversations, come up with different strategies, right? And also like try to implement them, right? And also look at ways in which we can look at liberation outside of the system, right? Because like this economic empowerment, all this stuff is great in the short term, but what do we need long term, right? And if we define ourselves as strong, like if we don't only define ourselves as strong as far as like being physical, then what about emotional and spiritual? Right? Like being able to showcase vulnerability is a strength, like was said earlier. Right? We need to be able to trust our community enough to be like, hey, this is how I feel, and this is what we need to go through, and how can we find out ways in which we can combat this, but also be able to hold them accountable when they do stuff too. Right. I think also this conversation about accountability needs to be had, because that's what happens going back to these mechanisms that we had back in the homeland. Like the community was accountable. When something happened, the community stepped in. Right. We didn't have to go to an outside entity. The entity was within us. Right. The morality was generated by the community in conversation with the individual within those communities. Right. So if we talking about being strong, then we have to make sure that our communities are strong. And in order to make those communities strong is we have to have these conversations and be able to have a conversation about what it means to be human, what it means to have Black excellence, right? Because Black excellence is not just us being having these degrees; it's us being human too, right? Like my grandmother didn't have a college degree, but she was excellent because she got up every day to try to figure out ways in which to make sure that we were fine, right? In a system that was not for her or for us. Right. And so being able to like see those models, but the good parts about those models and the bad parts, and also reconnect those to what we had back in the day, to learn from it, sankophically, right? To return back. I think that's where we get our freedom and liberation from. That's how we're gonna get these conversations and the mechanism to say, hey, we got it.
Right.
Right.
Because I still think that the church is very much a necessary entity, right? But what I think has to happen is, number one, there's got to be the involvement of young people's voices. You know, there has to be the involvement of young people's voices. And I think that an exodus from church is more hurtful than helpful, because if we look at the history of our people, the church has always been the nucleus of our community, right? It's where we gather, it's where we fellowship, it's where we get spiritual strength. And so I'm not negating the negative things that we've seen come out in the news, but a lot of that is about there has been no balance. Mm-hmm. People have to, there's something called discernment, right? And black people in particular really have that thing where we be like, it's something ain't right about bruh. I don't feel right about this, right? That's discernment. Now, sometimes some of us let it go over to the area of paranoia, and we have to kind of get ourselves back on track. But for the most part, we have intuitive sense, and that is discernment. And so a lot of times we ignore, remember, I go back to that thing about cognitive dissonance, right? Where we ignore reality, but live in it at the same time. And so we've got to be more involved so that we can see some of the changes that we want to be made within the church, right? Like, I love church, but I'm also a very big critic of church, in honesty. Like, I think that one of the things that churches have got to start doing is they've got to start talking more about mental health and wellness. Mm-hmm. Some stuff you can pray about it, but you also need a therapist and a counselor. So they need to employ therapists and counselors on staff. I think it is very bad advice to tell somebody just pray it away and that person has severe depression, right? But I don't think that it is malicious advice. What I think it is sometimes there is a little bit of ignorance mixed in, because for so long in our communities, preachers and teachers were thought to know everything, right? So there was this sort of lack of balance. But I think that change that we want to see, will only come about when we get involved in some of these places and spaces that we know change needs to occur. So we're ready to wrap this thing up, and I've seen some awesome comments, right? Mr. Word said that, Mr. Word, how ironic is it that you pastor and your name is Mr. Word, Cadillac or Honda? Come on now.
Yes, Cadillac.
But some of these comments that we have are absolutely awesome. Like Mr. Word and Tracy talked about the nurturing that they received at Cheyney. Mrs. Renika Adams talked about the nurturing that she received. She received at Lincoln, and so our schools are very much necessary. And so I think that another way that healing is going to be brought about is that we've got to undo some of this intraracial pathology, right? Because when you talk about the issues of texturism, colorism, and featureism, these are some things that we've got to undo, because those are also sick ways of thinking that happen to be very divisive to our communities. Mm-hmm. And you may say, well, Dr. Howard, what does that have to do with Kendrick Lamar's song and him talking about trauma? There is so much research that talks about how dark-skinned men and women a lot of times are more likely, or dark-skinned children are more likely to be abused. Dark-skinned girls within the school system are more likely to be receive punitive treatments, right? How Black women of a certain body type are more likely to be abused. And so all of these things have to do with these sort of mindsets, and we got to undo the thinking. And so I would say that it becomes incumbent upon you guys after hearing these sort of discussions, because there is a proverb that says, to whom much is given, much is required, right? So you've been given an opportunity to receive the truth. Now it becomes incumbent upon you to take the truth out to other people. And I don't care how uncomfortable it seems, right? But dismantling racism, dismantling racial trauma is everybody's job. And even though it may be uncomfortable, get in those uncomfortable spaces and tell the truth. Let me tell you something. I say in a drop of a heart, I don't care who I'm around. If I hear somebody talking about colorism or texturism, I say in a heartbeat, that's ignorance.
Mhm.
What does that mean for people who don't fit what you say this MO of beauty is? That's less about preference and more about self-hatred.
I mean, yeah, and also just to piggyback, like this conversation about work, right? Like it is work, right? It's going to take us a continuous conversation, right? Even at the very end, when Kendrick, when Lamar was like talking about "I forgive you," right? I release you, like all that type of stuff, like affirmation, trying to break intergenerational trauma. That's a ever occurring work. It's not a one-time thing. And so knowing that uncomfortability to sit into like those traumatic things to overcome trauma is work. To have joy is also work, right? To build community is work. And and to knowing that in order for us to get where we want to go to, right, we have to also define where we want to be at, right? Where we want to be at defines like how we define what we want, what liberation looks like. That's where we want to go to. So we also need to know that doing this work is going to be work. It's going to be an ever-present conversation, right? Because we're presently within this oppressive system. We always have to constantly re-heal ourselves. That's only going to happen through a communal like model, right? Based upon our own cultural conversations.
I love it. I love it. And Mrs. Stevens says, culturally, the African American church was seen as a mechanism for mental health, but never talked about it or really got in touch with it. I think that generally these walls are breaking down. I think you are so right. Ms. Tracy said that spiritual strength and healing trauma may mean looking at ancient African healing mechanisms. Okay, Ms. Tracy. Mr. Word says that we need prayer and resources to help those who are dealing with issues, right? So I think that this has been a phenomenal conversation. Make sure that you like, tag, share, comment, because we want this to grow, right? We want this to grow because, you know, we want to make sure that not only our students are involved in the conversation, but our community. Dr. Ledbetter, Dr. Simmons, do you want to give out your social media handles? Do you want people to follow you, or do you have a book that you would like to mention? You know, any sort of book that you have out that people can purchase?
I'm not on social media, but one of the things that I do, I teach an African history class every Saturday. It's free, and it's online. I'll put the link in the chat. Folks want to join. There's a course website associated with it. So it's all free information. You can pass it on to others. You can join. But no, I don't have anything to sell. Everything is for free.
Okay, all right. I think that's wonderful, Dr. Ledbetter, but you got to get you something to sell too. So, Dr. Simmons, come on.
I don't have everything to sell just yet. I
Okay,
just got
that's
done.
all right.
But I would say in the chat there is I put a link up talking about different resources for Black mental health. Also, if there's a book that I always recommend for individuals to read, especially within the Black community, is called All About Love by Bell Hooks. Because she goes through conversations about love, but she defines love what it is from a individualized standpoint, a communal standpoint, a scholarly standpoint. Like she reconceptualized what we think what love is. Love's not all about acts, but she really defines it, right? In order to push back against the patriarchal system that we in. So I'd recommend that. Anything by Angela Davis, Bayard Rustin, right? I think that like freedom for us comes from us, right? Liberation that we want and we try to obtain comes from us. And so the only way that I feel that we're going to get towards the liberation that we want is to have these conversations and build our liberatory practice for ourselves, right? We can't wait upon the system to do that for us. They're not going to do that. And I'm not going to hold my breath for it either, right? But yeah, we are going to be in this fight and it's going to continue to be a continuous struggle. But yeah, those are books I recommend. And those are things that I would like for us to continue to read, continue to grow and to build.
Okay, awesome. Did any of our joinees, did you guys have anything you want to say? Mr. Fuller, Mr. Word, Mr. Smith, Ms. Stevens, did you guys have anything you want to add?
I would just say it was a great conversation. I made sure that I logged in to be a part of this. I agree with everything my brothers have stated, as well as you, my sister. this was needed, and it's something that's needed more often. I don't think we have taken the time to really talk about these issues and be real about it. You know, some conversations sugarcoat and over, you know, cover the real issues. And I love the transparency of not only this conversation, but to tie it with Kendrick's song. I'm gonna be honest with you, I never really listened to Kendrick Lamar, but this song spoke to me and it brought out some feelings and emotions and things that I did just as the song stated. So I'm glad to see that he did this, because I'm hoping that people will really take the time to think, reflect, and then don't be afraid to talk. Because we can't be afraid to talk and be straightforward and put it out there, because that's where the thing comes from. So thank you for having us and allowing us to be a part. And I hope we have many more like this, because it's definitely needed.
Thank you, Mr. Word. Thank you. And to our to brothers and sisters who are watching, who are not Black, this conversation is also for you, right? Because Black people can't heal racism. It takes all of us having that same conversation, right? Because the inhumanity of racism is very insidious and has in many ways dehumanized the way that people see Black people. So this is a conversation that has to be had outside of our community as well as within our community. And we can't do it by ourselves, because a lot of times people think, oh, they're just complaining about something else. No, these are very real issues that continue to happen that have to be dealt with, and we are a world family. I was about to break out in the course of We Are the World, but that wouldn't be appropriate right now, right? But, in order for us to live in the world and live in some sort of harmonious conditions, we have got to fight for one another. And that's one thing that Black folks have always done, is fight for everybody. Even you look at the civil rights movement, many of the civil rights bills were always inclusive of other minorities, because it is always Black people's heart to be inclusive. And so we need a little reciprocity, y'all. We need a little reciprocity. But we thank you for tuning in today. I'm sure Dr. Simmons and Dr. Ledbetter will be back. I know we're going to get some awesome feedback. We thank our Cheyney family and our community for watching today. You guys have been phenomenal. Even the feedback that we've been getting on YouTube has been phenomenal. So we hope that you all have an awesome day. Make sure if you got a graduating senior, check out Cheyney University, cheyney.edu, okay? And we would love to hear from you. Have an awesome day.